Hi, everyone. Welcome to Scottish Summit 2021 edition. My name is Jim Novak, and this is my session titled Advanced Liquid Templates and Power Apps Portals. I'd like to first, before we get into everything, talk about our sponsors, give a shout out and thank you to everyone who's donated their time and resources to make this event possible. As everyone knows who's put on an event, without this support, we wouldn't be able to bring everybody this great content and these wonderful sessions. So thank you to ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, Red Spire, Agilicis, and Hitachi Solutions. Thank you once again for making this event possible. My name is Jim Novak. As I said, my small company is just me. It's independent consulting. It's called Futures Consulting. Been doing technical architecture for the last several years around Power Apps portals. So hope to share some of my experiences with liquid templates and some of the magic that the templating language brings to your portal solution. Here's a few different channels, Twitter and my website and MVP profile to reach out, say hello, provide some feedback. Always looking for comments and suggestions on how to improve this session and my presentation. So enough about me. Let's get into the agenda. What are we going to cover today? I'm going to assume that everybody who's in the session knows a bit about liquid templates. I do have a bit of a recap that I'll include in the slides, but in the interest of time, I'll assume you're familiar with liquid templates, the language, some of the fundamentals of it, and we'll just dive right in. First thing that I think is really important to talk about liquid templates when you're doing advanced templating is data collections. Typically, you're going to dive into a liquid template whenever you've got data you want to show that isn't easily rendered with configuration. So that's an important starting point for working with our templates. Next, we'll look at a specific method for getting data collections out of Dataverse. Almost said CDS, but it's Dataverse now. And FetchXML is a method that a lot of people that have been doing dynamics and Power Apps portals, Dataverse model-driven apps should be familiar with FetchXML, and we can use it in our portals. And it's a really powerful method for grabbing data out of Dataverse and bringing it into our portal for rendering. And then next, we'll look at a situation where you might want to serve up data to other pages and scripts within your portal. And to do that, you can use web templates as a service. So I can use it as essentially opening up a REST endpoint in my portal using a web template. We'll look at an example of that. That one can be handy in a lot of different situations. So I wanted to cover it here in this session. And then a big part of this, so those are some cool things we can do, pulling data around and using services. Let's look at how we can reuse our code. As with any programming language, reuse is important. We don't want to be copying, pasting code all over the place. So we want to look at the includes tag that allows us to do a very powerful liquid template tag allows us to do a reuse within our solution. And then we'll take a step further into extending templates. I'm looking at two additional tags that allow us to leverage templates in different situations outside of just the includes. And then we'll tie it all together. How are we going to use all these different methods for building our complex custom pages? And we'll look at some examples of these with a portal that I've been working on for a while. That should give us a real world illustration of how to leverage these different capabilities to deliver a more robust portal that can be done just through configuration. So let's get right into our first topic, data collections and liquid templates and Power Apps portals. So when you make your decision to work with liquid templates, a lot of times it's driven by the need to render data on a portal that you can't do with normal out-of-the-box capabilities. For example, you want to throw something on your screen with an entity list and it just isn't quite formatted correctly. Or you have some complex filtering you want to apply that you can't just do through configuration. And that's where using liquid templates and bringing back data lists, data collections, rendering them manually can really be a powerful tool. And two items when dealing with lists in liquid templates that are really, really important to understand are arrays and dictionaries. Very similar in what they offer, but there's some key distinctions. An array is a list of elements that is accessible by index or like the position or ordinal within the list, like item 7. Whereas a dictionary offers up key value pairs. You can access an item using a unique key in that collection. For example, I might have a key called Jim, where I can access an item at position Jim. And both of these can be iterated over using the for statement, in our case, a for tag. In a lot of other languages, JavaScript, C#, Java, etc., you can iterate over loops using the for statement. Similar structure called a tag. We can use the for tag in liquid templates. A couple of things about it that are kind of cool, though. You have a little bit more power than just iterating over a loop or over a list of items and spitting out items into your screen. You can evaluate things before you start working on it. You can know where you are in position when iterating on a loop. Two of those properties, for example, one's called size, where I can say how many items in my list. That might be important. We'll look at an example here in a second where it helps. And you have what's called a for loop object that gives you some context when you're within that loop of what's going on in your iteration. It can be really, really powerful. And two other tags, two other filters, I should say. You have array filters called batch and group by that you can apply to your collections and bring back into a different variable your list that is batched together using a different criteria. And we'll look at an example of this. Or you can group by different criteria. Like, for example, if I want to group by a certain property, say it's a category or a tag, and we'll look at an example there. So there's a lot of things you can do with an array and a dictionary in Liquid rather than just spitting out the stuff in the list. And very simple examples here. We have an entity list with a property called views, and we can iterate over just this array and spit out the view name right out of the Microsoft documentation. And then I can also access the view item at position 0. Whereas a dictionary, I can access a param in the array of or dictionary of parameters by ID. And I can also say, if I don't have any items in the list in my dictionary of params, don't do anything. Saves us some time instead of spitting out items in an empty list. So we can evaluate our lists before starting iterating on them, and it gives us some really powerful tools for working with lists of items in Liquid templates. So now that we see how cool arrays and dictionaries are and how powerful the Liquid templating language is in working with lists of data, let's look at a method for getting data into those structures for evaluation and for rendering on screen. FetchXML might be familiar to some people here. If you've worked with Dynamics in the past, or if you've worked with model-driven apps and Dataverse, formerly CDS, you might have worked with FetchXML. It's a query language offered up by the Dynamics platform, which is now part of the Power Platform in the Dataverse apps and model-driven apps. It's a way of doing an XML-based query for data within your Dataverse database services. So, as we mentioned before, your out-of-the-box tools, your page templates, web forms, entity forms, etc., entity lists, all that fun stuff might not be the best method for getting your data out of the system. So that's where FetchXML comes in. If I've got some complex filtering I need to do that I can't really do in an entity list, for example, and I need to do it dynamically, FetchXML will allow us to do that. And behind the scenes, an entity list is actually just looking at FetchXML anyway. So let's just bypass the middleman and use FetchXML ourselves. And the cool thing about it is it allows us to parameterize our queries. So if I've got an input on the screen, I've got a drop down, for example, and I want to bring back a list of states for a country, I can make a selection on the screen, render another list of FetchXML, and pop in some values that are dynamically entered by a user. Just one example, but it allows me to parameterize my query that I might not be able to do using the out-of-the-box entity list. Cool thing is a lot of the stuff that's in FetchXML for other parts of the Power Platform, like link entities and aliases, they're supported in what's returned back to our Liquid template structures as well. So I can have a join, which in FetchXML, a link entity is effectively an inner join or an outer join if you're doing a SQL type language. That's really, really powerful stuff. So you might be doing some really complex queries that aren't supported in the out-of-the-box tools. And what it returns is this is where we tie it back to our data structures, data lists. It returns, and I'm going to make sure I get this right, it returns an object that contains an array of entity records, each with a dictionary of attribute values. So I've got my rows and I've got my columns coming back from my query. And that's where we're populating our arrays and dictionaries that we looked at previously using a FetchXML query. The really, really cool thing here is we're not just going to be pulling back any data that we want. Any of the entity permissions that you've already configured against the entities you're querying against in Fetch are going to be applied. So you're protecting yourself against just querying for all kinds of stuff. It's not a backdoor to go and bring back data that you should not be seeing as a portal user. So that's really, really cool stuff. And the reason I mention it is not just because it's cool, but once you start working with FetchXML, one thing that happens probably every single time I put together a new FetchXML query is I forget to turn on the entity permissions for it. I get no data back and I get really frustrated. So just something to keep in mind that entity permissions are applied whenever you run your FetchXML query. If you're not getting data back, make sure that stuff's turned on for the appropriate context of your portal. So let's dive right in and let's look at an example of this. We've been looking at slides so far. Let's look at an example in code of a Liquid template calling out fetch using FetchXML to bring back data into our dictionaries and arrays. So to start looking at some Fetch XML in Liquid templates, what I've done is I'm going to bring up Visual Studio Code. And what we're looking at here is an export of a Power Apps portal that I've been working on for a while. And we'll go into a little in our other examples, and we'll bring it up and I'll show you what it looks like. It's an event management portal that I've been building for a while called 365 Power Up. And what I've done is I've exported out all of our Liquid templates onto disk so that we can easily look at them. So if you're wondering where I got this from, I use an XRM Toolbox tool, the script manager, to export this out. If you want to try it, it's pretty cool stuff. So what we're looking at here is I have a Liquid template, and it's called Power Up Session Details Fetch. And what it is, it's just a web template configured, standard web template. And I'm looking at the content body, I believe is what it stores. It's just a big blob of Liquid. And all this consists of is a series of Fetch XML statements. You've got a series of Fetch XML tags that are just going to run fetch and bring back data into a series of variables. So the Fetch XML tag, you can go dig into the details of the documentation. They finally updated the documentation with the Fetch XML tag. What it does is it's relatively straightforward, relatively easy to use. It just basically says, in the following fetch, run it, and bring back the values into the variable right after my fetch XML tag. The one that's the name tag called fetch XML, put the results into this variable called session. It's similar to an assign statement, and that's what the Liquid templating engine will do. Is it'll execute the fetch and put the values back into session. And one of the things I'm using up above in that first statement, again, assuming everybody's familiar, this is an assign statement. I'm going to go and get the ID value off of the URL from the request.params. And this is an example that we looked at earlier. I have a request object with a dictionary property, a property of type dictionary, that I can access the values in that list by identifier. And in this case, it's literally ID. So I'm going to get the ID of the record that's being called. And in my case, the context is I'm going to pass in a session ID, which is a table in my Dataverse database. And I'm going to go out and get the identifier of that so I can run some fetch queries on it. So the fetch, again, if you're familiar with fetch, it should be just like you're familiar with. The distinction is, the only different thing I'm doing here in my Liquid template is I'm parameterizing it, and I'm passing in the ID as an additional filter for the session ID. You can see I've got my publisher, PowUp, and I'm going to pass in the session ID into my table called PowUp session. And here's the stuff I'm going to return. And the end result, it'll spit out all the results of that query into that variable called session. I've got another one down here doing almost identical type logic, giving all the speakers for this session. And then here we can see the link entity that we were talking about. I can do a join and bring back values, filtering. In fact, I'm filtering on that link entity just like I would do in any other Fetch XML query. And it's supported. And I've got the alias here that is going to put the session back in as the alias. And I've got another variable being populated with the result of that Fetch XML query called speakers. Another one down here called tags, and another filter. I'm going to filter by the same thing, allowing me to use one identifier to filter all the information related to the session. And then I've got a series of links. And I'll show you in a moment what this ends up looking like in the portal. But what I'm doing is, for this session, give me all the stuff about this session in these series of fetch statements, filtering by ID that was passed into the parameters collection, the dictionary, and I'm going to populate a whole bunch of variables with all the information about this session so that I can render it on screen. And it's all in one Liquid template, and I can execute this one time, and it'll give me all these variables filled in with all the information about the session. So let me jump over to the portal, and I will just show you what we've been talking about. This is a Dynamics 365 portal, I think is what it started as, but ultimately it's just a Power Apps portal. I don't think we're using any of the case management or the CRM capabilities. I built my own custom Dataverse database on it, and it allows me to show events. And this is standard stuff all out of the box, but I use Liquid to do some of the theming and some of the front page stuff. This is standard configuration, static stuff. But what I've done is I've got a list of events that we talked about, but I've got a list of events. And if I open up one of the events, and let's look at Tampa, because it's probably warm down there right now. So let's go check out Tampa and see what this event looks like. This is a Liquid template. We'll get into this a little bit more in our other examples. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to show the results of that query. So here is the screen that I built to use the data that was rendered in that previous Liquid template. So that Fetch XML brought back the session titled Development in ALM with CDS and Visual Studio Code. It brought back the abstract, right? The details about it. Here are the list of speakers that were brought back in that variable called speakers, right? So I got my session variable. I've got my speakers that was brought back in the join. I remember we had a list of links as well at the very bottom, and here we only have one. And then I've also got a list of tags at the top. I've got a parent category. I have a multi-use data table called session tag, I believe it's called. And what it allows me to bring back is a parent child. And I've got a parent tag or a parent category with child tags that I have put into these little pills. And this is standard Bootstrap stuff. I'm leveraging Bootstrap 3 that's offered up by the Power Platform portal. It comes with out-of-the-box configuration, but I took all of that information and I rendered it. And this is obviously not done with configuration. This is done with a custom script. So it's pretty cool that I was able to pull that data back and render it however I wanted. So let me show you real quick where that's being done. So I first mentioned, and just to catch up where we're at, we first said, let's go get some liquid templates and let's pass in an identifier of the session and let's go do the query. You're seeing the end result of this. So let's go take a look at how you would actually evaluate the results of those fetch queries. So I'm going to jump back over to Visual Studio Code again, and I'm going to bring up another template that is going to use the results of this fetch we just looked at. We saw what it looks like. Well, how did it get rendered that way? I've got another liquid template, web template, sorry, that contains liquid. So it's a web template containing liquid that I'm using to evaluate the results of those previous queries. And what I'm looking at here at the very, very top, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of us, we're going to look at this include statement as we talked about in our agenda, but let me just skip past that and look at the first assign. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to get the session we're talking about. The previous set of fetch statements had a single ID, right? So we're going to assume that one value is being brought back. That's an assumption on our part because we're passing in an identifier of a session. So with our fetch, we're joining on the session ID. We should only get one back. So as we talked about, this is an example of how I evaluate the results of my fetch query being pulled into the structure that contains arrays and dictionaries. First thing I have is the session variable we looked at before I declared in my fetch statement. It's got an additional property called results, and there's some other information off the session variable. But what I'm focusing on right now is the results in the rows being brought back in that fetch query, the records, if you want to call it that. So first thing I'm doing is I'm going to say I've got a results object, and it's got an array of entities, I believe is what the slide said. And because it's an array, I'm going to access it by index. And I'm going to say, give me the first item in the list because I'm assuming there's one there. So some assumptions here, but you can see that I'm accessing an array by index. And the next bit I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the tags. I've got another variable that I populated with the tags. I'm going to look at the results, and I've got the entities collection again, the entities array, which is a list of entities. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that filter and I'm going to apply the group by filter, and I'm going to apply it by the group by, the group name property, the attribute column name called group name. So this allows me to put into another variable. I've got this array of items populated by fetch, and I'm going to apply the tag we looked at before called group by, and it's going to put it into a variable called tag groups. So this is another special structure that allows me to iterate over a series of parent-child collections that have got groups with items in them. So that's pretty cool. So first thing I can do is grab one record called session and get all the attributes associated with it. Then I can look at the associated groups because I know that I joined against the session ID, and then I can render them on screen. So what we're looking at here, first bit is the title, right? We had the session title and subtitle, and here is standard liquid accessing the attribute, the variable called session with an attribute called PowUp name. And this is standard Dataverse stuff. I've got an attribute, a column name, depending on what they're calling it this week. Let's call it a column called PowUp name, and I'm rendering that on screen. And I've got the subtitle as well. And those are what we saw on the top of the screen. Then the first thing I'm going to do at the top of that screen as well is I'm going to get the track ID. And it's a little bit different syntax here because session is an entity reference, like you would see in code. So if you're not familiar with that in development, it's kind of a very lightweight version of a record in CDS. And I can go and grab the name property off of that for the first track. That was the group that we saw at the top. And then for each of the tags that we saw in the pills, here's where I can iterate over those tag groups. I've taken those tags and I've grouped them together into sub lists, right? So I've got four tags here. I'm going to iterate first over the tag groups that we put into our using our group by filter, and then each of those has a list of items. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to render those as span elements. I'm going to use the Bootstrap badge class and badge pill, and I'm applying the styles and all that fun stuff we saw. Then I'm going to grab the name property off of it. So I've got a tag all the way down into grouping by the collection of items into a list of groups with subgroups, and I'm going to iterate over those. It looks much more complex than it is. It basically just said, take that list of tags, group them together, and allow me to iterate over the groups, which is really, really cool stuff, because if I had to iterate through that manually, like keeping track when the group changed, whenever the group name changed, if I had to iterate over that, which I did before I saw the group by tag, it's really painful stuff. But this is a really simple structure that we get, and it's a really powerful method for iterating over collections. And again, tying back the last two slides we talked about, we've got arrays, we've got dictionaries of items, and I've got these different filters and tags that I can apply for iterating over these items. And this is 3 or 4 lines of code, essentially, right? I've only got, again, that's including my end tags, to iterate over a series of items being brought back in a related fetch query all in one statement. And down below, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. Similar thing is happening with the speakers. I've got a list of speakers associated with a session. I'm going to go and iterate over the list of speakers, the entities, and just basically spit out their name. And here's some fanciness with filters on items. I'm stripping out the new lines. That allows me to display HTML being escaped, which is kind of nice. Then down here, I'm going to do the links as well. And we've got one of those. I'm going to build a URL in the page. So all of that rendered from one web template that calls multiple fetch queries. So it's kind of nice. We have pretty much self-contained all the information about a session that we can pull back and render using all the liquid in this page here. So we've separated our data from our presentation. And there's a whole bunch of development patterns you can talk about there, but essentially allow me to put all of the queries in one place for the data regarding a session, and then I have one place where I can render it. So it's pretty powerful stuff whenever we look at the retrieval of data and then what do we do with it. So we've taken a look at working with data in Power Apps portals and liquid templates via dictionaries and arrays. Those give us the ability to iterate on data brought back from the portal, as opposed to using custom configuration using the out of the box configuration. Then we looked at fetch. The fetch tag allows us to execute fetch queries, putting data into those different structures, and we can iterate on them, looking at the example here, and rendering it on screen for the end user. Well, what if I have a situation where I don't want to put it on screen? Well, that's what our next topic is. We want to look at web templates as a service. I may have a situation where I want to serve up data only. I don't want to put things on a screen. I'm not rendering stuff in the UI. I'm going to serve up data. And it might be for another part of my portal, or it might be to an external service. Well, unfortunately, portals right now, Power Apps portals doesn't offer a standard REST endpoint. I believe you can serve up an entity list as data, but a standard just let me do a REST API call doesn't really exist right now. So what we can do is we can use web templates to do that. And this is based off of an article by Colin Vermander, for which I have the link in the link section of the slides. So I'll get that to everybody after the session. But it's a really, really cool idea, very, very straightforward. But it gives us a lot of power in our portal. If we want to serve up data for something that we can't do through configuration, or let's say we have a third-party control and we want to serve up data for a calendar or a map, and I can show you an example of those, we can do that through passing back our own data structures. And the basic setup steps are, you create a web template that renders JSON as opposed to HTML, or XML as opposed to HTML, or any other data structure you want. Just the examples we're talking about, we're going to talk about JSON and XML. Second, you set up a web template and you serve up this new liquid data structure, right? Liquid generated data structure, JSON, XML, whatever it is. And you have to set the MIME type. That's the kicker, so that the portal knows to spit back the appropriate MIME type when rendering the result. Then what you do is you create a new page with a page template that uses your web template. And the kicker here is that, and again, very simple step, but very important, is you disable header and footer, meaning you don't want to render the header with all the includes of all the JavaScript and all the other stuff coming with a portal, or the footer, right? All the same about stuff. Just return the raw value of the web template whenever the page renders that's using this page template web template. Then what you do is you just call this through a URL. So you have a page that has a URL, call it through an HTTP request. If you load it directly, I'll show you an example of that, and we'll take a look at what it spits out. So it's a relatively simple setup. You have a new web template that serves up only the data you want. You change the MIME type, and you disable header and footer, and then you can spit out any data in any format you like using your standard web template tools. So let's take a look at that. Let's jump over and we'll take a look at an example in the portal, and then we'll take a look at some of the code behind it. So let me jump back over to our Visual Studio Code and our liquid templates, and let me go look at another template that we have that's a little bit hard to read, but it's spitting out JSON and is trying to be very compact with the white space. So it's a little bit hard to read, but the idea is to spit out as clean of formatted JSON as possible. And what this web template will do is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to render JSON. So session details JSON. So it's similar to what we looked at before, where it's going to bring back the same session details, and instead of rendering it as HTML, it's going to render it as JSON. And again, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, we're looking at an include statement here, power up session details fetch, and that's going to call the same fetch that the other page used. And there's an example, again, getting a little bit ahead of our slides, but I'm reusing the same data that I am for the page we looked at in our example to render JSON. So instead of rendering HTML, I'm going to have a web template that spits out JSON. And what we're looking at here is same thing. I've got a session coming back from the FetchXML that was triggered before, that was rendered before using the include statement, and I'm going to do the same thing with my tag group. So we already know what that'll do. Now I'm just going to iterate on this data. I've got my session information, and the root structure is going to be the session, and then I'm going to have a series of arrays within my JSON that render the related information. And in this case, let's zip down here and look at speakers. So I'm going to iterate using the for statement, just like we did, the same exact idea happening here. I'm going to iterate through the speakers list, and I have another helper template here with the include, but I'm going to include a contact photo structure that allows me to render the URL for the photo. But then I've got full name, standard stuff, standard attributes here, and a description. Here's the escaping we looked at before, and then my end for statement. And notice this is a property on JSON, a JSON element, a JSON attribute. I'm not sure the exact syntax for that or the name of it, but it's got an array, and it's going to build an array of these speakers. It's going to do the same thing for categories, and instead of putting out HTML and spans that we saw before, I'm going to go through my group items and put them into child JSON elements. So it's just raw data. And again, it's a little bit hard to read, but here's a really good example of a loop, a tool on the loops, a tag called unless that allows me to put a closing quote here on a for loop whenever I'm at the last item. Pardon me, unless I'm on the last item, I'm going to put in a comma. So this allows me to evaluate where I am in the loop, which is pretty cool, so that I can format things correctly as opposed to having to keep track of index and whatnot. So there's an example of what we were looking at with a dictionary and array item loop, for tag and the for loop object, where I can check where I am in rendering this loop. Really simple stuff, but really, really, really helpful whenever you're rendering nested loops like this. I want to close out my comma or whenever it's appropriate, only when it's appropriate. And then here's the links again, same thing. So I've got this web template, and what does it look like when it's in action? Let me jump over to the portal, and I'll just show you a real live example of it. So I've got my PowerUps portal, and let me just look at a URL. And in fact, let me jump over and look at the page setup first. I've got the web template that I mentioned, and I created a page like we talked about. And I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to start at the page. And I've got a page here called PowerUp Session. Pardon me, session details service, and it's got a page template as we talked about, and it's basically named almost the same, but it's called JSON, details JSON, because it's serving up JSON. And this is the flag we talked about on the page template, website footer and header. Do not turn on the website footer and header. So that way, only what is spit out by the JSON, only what is rendered by the web template is put out in its raw form. If I included the header here, it would put out all of the additional includes, and it wouldn't be useful JSON. So let me drill into the web template that we were just looking at. So here's the details we were just looking at that we exported. And the bit that I wanted to show you is the MIME type. So all of this configured that we talked about in the slide. I've got my MIME type, and again, I'm going in the backwards direction. So I've got my web template with the MIME type set. I've got the content we looked at. I'm not going to turn on the header and footer in my page template. I'm going to go back up to my page, and I've got a URL for my page. So I've got a partial URL session service. So what that looks like is, here's the URL. I've got my 365 Power up, and this is open to the world, because if you want to go grab this information and show it on your portal, go right ahead. This is meant to be open. It's all public stuff. So there's no security behind it, even though if I had entity permissions on, the fetch that I mentioned before would also apply the entity permissions. In this case, you can see the params we were looking at. Here's the ID that comes off the URL, which is populated into the request.params. So we were looking at this before. This is how we get it to our web template. And here's the partial URL we looked at, session service, and you notice it's spitting out raw JSON. Do view page source, and it looks the same. So you notice it's a little bit of white space in there, but I tried to spit out as clean JSON as I could. But what we're looking at here is the session example we had in our Tampa session, right? And this is the JSON that's representing this page. And I cheated a little bit. I showed you a page template, the rendering this HTML, but what's actually happening in the portal after I did the web template example is I actually have some JavaScript that pulls this up. So I kind of cheated a little bit. I first started with the web template that renders this HTML, and instead what I do is I have some JavaScript in this page that when the modal loads, it's going to go out and invoke this REST endpoint, I'm doing air quotes, this endpoint that serves up JSON, and it's going to use that to render this page. So I render this page in JavaScript as opposed to liquid templates spitting out HTML. So it's an example of a couple of things. We're now rendering this information, we're serving up this information through either a web template or through a JSON structure, and I can render it with code, or I can render the web template. And we also looked at, let me go back to the page. All this information can be rendered, can be changed on the fly using just by tweaking a template. The data behind it remains the same, whether it's coming from JSON or from a web template rendering HTML. And that's some pretty nice flexibility. And again, an end user, let's say somebody listening to this session, might want to go grab that information and put it onto their portal. I've got dual use. I'm using one time. I don't have multiple sets of code rendering this information, serving this information up. I've just made myself a multi-use data service using web templates. And that's some pretty powerful stuff. And you can see it's not super elaborate. I can get very, very fancy here, or I can keep it very, very simple. I can serve up JSON that only has a couple of elements, or I can serve up a lot of detail here. I have got HTML, I've got some dates and time formats, I've got URLs to images, all kinds of stuff coming about. So it's a very, very powerful method for serving up all kinds of data, whether it's complex or simple, in our portal, whether it's going to be used by our portal ourselves or serving up external systems. So a very, very powerful tool for rendering data using liquid templates. So hopefully you see the usefulness in that, and the ability to serve up data and not just rendering pages on your portal. So back to our slides, and let's look at the next topic very quickly. It is the include tag. We've talked about this a couple of times so far. We've actually seen it in use, but include is fundamental for code use. I'm going to read my slide because that is absolutely true. So the include tag allows us to do kind of what it sounds like. We can include another web template as part of our current web template. It effectively injects the code from another web template into the current template we're in. And we saw that in a couple of examples, but here's a real simple example right out of the box templates. So you'll see all over the place, if you open up a generic web portal, PowerApps portal, and you just start poking around the web templates, you'll see include page copy in a lot of different places. And what does that mean? That says include the web template called page copy as if I'm rendering it in line. And it essentially says, if we look at the right side of the slide here, it says include page copy, and then what it'll do is it effectively replaces the content of page copy web template in our page. And that looks like the div class page-copy is the class, and the editable tag page ADX copy. So it's going to go out and grab the ADX copy attribute from the page object, put it in as HTML, and render liquid as true. Those are some parameters as part of our include tag. We just saw the example in the reuse of our FetchXML. I created a FetchXML for a session that takes an ID of a session and then calls out and retrieves all the data associated with the session. And I use it in two different places. I use it to render HTML, and I also use it to render JSON. I didn't have to change the data at all. We had one place where we define what data is being brought back, and I just decide what I want to do with it. So what it allows us to do is, again, reduce errors and standardize segments of your portal. If I don't have to copy this, I don't have to fix it in multiple places. And I standardize what data is being rendered at all these different places in the example we just looked at. I'm always going to have the same set of data brought back every time I use this template. And you can use it by calling it directly in the example here with page copy, or I can, just as a generic include page copy there, but I can also inject parameters. I can say, I want to change the logic of this template, and this time I call it. In the example down below, we see the parameters equals flexibility. I'm going to include a template called child navigation, but I'm going to pass in a parameter that says show descriptions is true. In this time, I want to call it, I want to show the descriptions, but in another place in in another page, I may not want to show the descriptions. So that's kind of nice. It's kind of like treating it as a function. I have a page template that has parameters that are passed in, and it'll change its logic based on what I pass in. So I can kind of treat them like template to like functions. And we'll look at an example of this. It'll make a little bit more sense whenever I show you the example, but that's pretty powerful. So not only am I going to just have a hardwired set of logic like the template that I had before, where I'm going to just return a bunch of fetch query rows, but I can have it do different things by passing in parameters like I'm doing in a function with code, with JavaScript, C#, etc. That's pretty cool. But to do that, you have to remember scope. Scope is important whenever you're calling your includes. If I have a variable, an assigned variable that is created outside of my page template, I can actually access that information within my template that's being called, and vice versa. Because it acts like it's just basically injecting it, think of it as one massive template glommed together at the time that it's called. So the scope makes sense. I can override variables, but I can use that. I can pass in a parameter to change the functionality, but I can also assign a variable in my child template and the one that's being called that I can access once it returns outside in the parent template. And that way I can kind of treat it as a function. I pass in some data, have it manipulated in the child template, the template being called, and then I use the value after the fact. And we'll look at an example that makes a little bit more sense. So includes allows us to reuse code, make sure that it's standard across the board. We fix our issues in one place, but we can also leverage includes as functions. We can have it perform specific logic on demand as needed by passing in parameters and having it populate variables that we know by convention. So let's jump over and take a look at that real quick at a quick example of includes in general, and then also how to use them as a function. So let's jump back over to Visual Studio Code and look at an example of our liquid include tag in action. We saw it up here, and basically what this will do is, imagine if I just took this liquid fetch and I said, select everything, and I'm just going to paste it in here. Now, obviously, that would be a bad idea because I'd have to maintain this everywhere it's being used. I'd rather have that one line to include all that other code. So and here's another example of a more compact example is treating it as a function. And this is not a tremendous amount of code, but I don't want to use this everywhere. And in fact, it's 11 lines with comments. What this will do is, this is a liquid template that takes a parameter called date to convert. But what it'll do is take a date and convert it to an integer. It was an example I found online that worked really well because I need to do date comparisons and it wasn't working too well for me. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking in this date, assigning it to a variable, and I'm converting down here in my big conditional, and I'm going to assign a variable called dataIsInt. Here's the convention part of it. And this is where we get into the risk of naming variables. Inside this template, I'm going to name this variable dataIsInt and assign a value. This date converted to an integer. Where I'm going to use it is in my other example called event details. And I'm going to call this template, passing in this example, I pass in the current date and time in this example, and I immediately grab that dataIsInt value. by convention, I knew that this template would populate this variable. So I'm able to grab it. Now, what do I do with it is I call it again down here using another date from the record that I'm looking at, and I'm going to populate it again right away into a variable. I could have used the wrong value if I didn't capture this right away. It would be capturing the old value, but now I can use it as a date comparison because it's an integer. So in a really, really simple example, I've got an include template being treated as a function. I pass in a value, it assigns a variable that I'm able to use whenever it returns. The risk is I might override values, I might have something named incorrectly, kind of like with JavaScript and global variables. But it's a really simple example of now I don't have to paste in these 11, 12 lines of code all over the place. I have one template that I pass in a parameter and I can get an output value. So it's a pretty handy way of using the include tag. So let's head back over to our slides and check out our next topic. And that is another topic for extending our templates using block and extend. So we've done include for reuse so we can leverage existing templates within other templates. Now we can look at block and extends to override and provide a common framework for both layout and functionality for your template. And the way it works is in one web template, you have a new tag you call block, and you define a discrete section of your web template that you want to be overridden or remain the same. So for example, header, body, and footer of a page. In another web template, what you do is you say, I'm going to extend my previous template, and I'm going to override only the parts I want to change. For example, I'm only going to override the body of the page. That way the header and the footer remain the same. That's a powerful method for standardizing your design and even some logic in your Power Apps portal. And in fact, it's used heavily by the default web templates shipped with a Power Apps portal. So we can jump over. Let's just jump over and take a real quick look at it in the samples we have in our Visual Studio Code. And we'll first take a look at one of the out-of-the-box templates called Full Page Template, right? So it's called Full Page, and it extends layout one column. And what that means is here is a template that's extending layout one column. If we look at layout one column, it's got a big chunk of HTML, and it's got a couple of blocks defined, one called breadcrumb, another one called title, and they are what they sound like. They're going to include the breadcrumb web template, which we know how that works now. It's going to include the page header, and then it's got block main. And the intent behind this one is it's a very generic method for laying out the header of the page, the title of the page, and then allowing anybody who wants to derive from this to override the main block of the page. So it's a very, very simple example, but it's used heavily throughout the rest of the portal to extend and customize, or sorry, standardize your layout. And another one, we used it in our template. What I did in this template we were looking at before is I extended layout one column as well. And I overrode the block title. And then I have another block down below called main, right? So I overrode the main block just like the other one, and another template below that, or block below that this is the end blocks. The only two that I cared about were the block title and block main. So I only overrode 2 bits of this, and I put a lot of stuff in here. You notice this is way, way, way different than the previous template. This is a huge page template that allowed me to do some pretty complex stuff, but I'm only overriding the 2 bits that I care about, and I'm still keeping the same structure as the layout one column. So I'm able to inherit all the container stuff, all the structure that this offers, and only override the parts that I care about. And in this case, the title and the main area. And what I did as well is I have another web template called Event Details Community, where I'm extending the one we just looked at. And the only thing I'm going to render here is I'm going to leave everything the same, and I'm going to render a very, very simple example or a variation, I should say, on the main block. You notice it's like 3 lines. I want to get rid of all the other details that this one shows. So I'm going to collapse this. And notice this does all kinds of stuff because it's a very specific type event. And what that looks like, if I go over back to the portal and show you the page, this is a standard event, right? So I've got all the stuff being rendered here. This is all liquid as well. I've got sessions by track, all kinds of fanciness happening here. I've got cards being popped up. I've got images being put in. But for a community event that isn't run by my Power Up team, I want to show a very, very simple one. So I'm going to go and look at past community events, and you can see the how it's rendered is very, very simple. This is all the same. That's awesome. I want to keep all that stuff. I want the event details. I want the links here. I want the calendar, and I want that header. There's some liquid behind here for the CSS. I want all that rendered too, but I only want to show this down from the bottom. So it's a very simple example of standardizing the layout of a page and only overriding the bits that you need. And it's really, really powerful for use in standardizing your template. Just like includes, you got reuse, but you've also got standardization. Back to our slides to wrap things up. So let's take a look at our last wrap up here, pulling it all together. So hopefully you've seen with some of these techniques, we can override the limitations of the out of the box capabilities and portals. We get entity forms and entity lists. They're awesome, but they're limited in what they can offer. We can apply custom styling. We can bring back all kinds of different data using FetchXML. We can use includes to reuse functionality across all of our templates using functions even. We can use block and extend to standardize our layout, but to customize our design and functionality, as well as serve up data within and without our template using the web templates as a service, serving up custom JSON or XML data. I'm going to include the slides for everybody in the uploads, but thank you to everybody who's attended. Thank you, everybody, for making this happen. Hopefully you had as much as fun as I have in presenting and attending all these awesome sessions.